A lot of you have been sending in questions about guitar action, and really something that we talk about quite a lot. This one came in not terribly long ago, and you can see that this is really high. And that's costing you pain, that's costing you money in trying out different strings. So let's answer some questions about the setup of your guitar to best improve it for you. Our first question is about the height of the strings. We had somebody write in asking with an action height of 4 on the first and slightly more than 4 on the sixth, and they feel like it's kind of stiff.
Yeah, that definitely would be stiff.
It would be.
For most players, yes.
Yeah, this is specifically for a nylon string. I like my action to be somewhere around like 3.5-ish on the bass side, so on the sixth string, and maybe like right around 3, slightly under for the first string, and I find that that's fairly easy.
That's the sweet spot for the vast majority of players.
Yeah, and you can work harder and maybe gain a little bit in terms of volume, but why work harder when microphones exist? By the way, if by the end of this video you think that we've earned your subscription, please go ahead and subscribe. Does high action negatively impact intonation?
It can.
It can.
It can. Depends on if the guitar was intended to have that from the get-go, and the bridge was placed to take into account the displacement of the string from the straight edge, which causes the string to go sharp when you push it to the fret. And if the guitar was set up to be like that, it will be fine for the intonation, or it should be.
Okay.
On the other hand, but if it was set, if you try to set that significantly lower, that could throw things off, and vice versa.
I think what we are getting to is our childhood favorite friend, Pythagoras.
Oh, yes.
With his lovely a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Because when you push down a string, essentially you're lengthening it.
That's right.
Right?
That's just placing it from the straight line between the nut and the saddle down to the fret.
Right. And
it's a slight section of a triangle.
It is, but it's not just one triangle, it's two.
Yes.
Because it's from where you push down your finger. So this is a constantly changing set of triangles, but essentially you have two right triangles, and at the first fret, you have a very small one and a very long one.
Yes.
And at the 19th, at the 12th fret, you have
your right angle. Well, wherever you push down on, at whichever fret you push down on, that's where the other segment of your right angle is. So.
That's right. Yes, a very high action can actually change the intonation, and as makers, what we do is we set the bridge based off of the action height accordingly, and we call that compensation.
Yes.
There's a lot of Spaniards who don't do that. I'm not throwing any shade at Spain, because we love your guitars, but
traditionally the guitars, the Spanish guitars, were made with very low actions and played with gut strings before nylon was invented. We're talking about 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century. So the players weren't displacing the strings very far to the fret. And number two, the gut has a lot of grip on your fingers. So when you play, you have a lot of control of pitch by pushing or pulling the string just with the very slightest change of technique.
Yeah.
Which is harder to do with nylon. Also harder to do with carbon.
Yeah.
Yes.
The carbon is very small, so you have very little friction between your fingers and the strings.
Correct.
Even less than nylon. By its nature, it has a slipperier surface, so your coefficient of friction is very low.
That's right. That's right.
Just a little pro tip, whenever you're changing with carbon strings, put an extra wrap on that treble side just for insurance.
Yes, they can very easily come unraveled at the bridge, and you're not realizing it as you're pulling it to tension.
I just leave enough string at the end to make sure I've got an insurance policy in place in case it does.
Yeah.
So go ahead and do that. Does action create more frequencies, or can you change the sound with the action height? So can you like improve it? Like, do you get more overtones? Do you get more or less?
In theory, a vibrating string will have all of the overtones present, except for the overtone that would occur at the position where it's plucked. That's the physics of it. In theory, the height of the string should not have much to do with the overtone series that the string produces. Now, where the action height is relevant to the player is if you're struggling with a guitar with high action and you're barely getting the string to the fret, particularly if you're holding a bar chord and you're playing a barred fretted note, you may not have that string positively in contact with that fret, that string at that fret. And if that's so, then the string is not going to sound very good.
I think that there's two things going on in this question that they didn't realize that they were asking.
Yes.
Typically with higher action, with most guitars also comes a higher moment of torque above the top. If you raise the action on a guitar with the intention of getting more resonance, it's, I think, because you're putting more rotational force from the height increase.
You're magnifying the efficiency of the energy transfer of the tension of the string to the soundboard.
Yes, and now this is up to your guitar. So modern guitars generally are a little bit more forgiving about having more torque because they're
more robust.
Yes. When you increase the action height above the soundboard, you are increasing the torque directly. So
it's a direct computation of the height times the tension.
Right. The more high it is, the more that is going to pull, and because the bridge essentially moves in a rocking forward-backward position. Think back to high school physics where you pulled on that rope and you plucked it and you felt it yank.
Yeah.
You're the bridge. The locker or door that you tie that rope to is your fret.
That's right. And many of the older Spanish instruments, like from Torres and that school, were made very delicately, very thin, with a very, very closer set of height above the soundboard of the strings. And those instruments don't benefit and won't tolerate having that torque increased. That's the thing to watch out for with those old instruments.
Yeah, I was remembering Simplicio that we had in here for a number of years ago, where somebody wanted the action higher, more to a modern standard, because they are typically around 2 millimeters on the first and 2.5.
Very low.
And they were designed to be caressed and loved, not muscled with modern technique.
Yes.
And this player wanted that modern technique, so they just put on a new saddle, and they said, it was easy. It cost $75 for a new saddle, or whatever it was.
Yeah, but...
And then we saw the guitar twisting. And we say that some twist is good, because that means that the guitar is going to respond. But that guitar was built so close to final tolerances that it was starting to twist itself apart. And that is actually not good twist.
That's right, that's right. So you cannot arbitrarily take an older instrument of that school, that old Torres school, and try to create a modern type of action on it and expect the guitar not to react negatively.
Yes, one does not simply just raise the action.
That's right, not a good idea.
And our next question is, I have a cheap guitar. Would adjusting the action help because my first string is playing flat above the 7th fret and only my first string?
If it's only the string, my learned opinion would be it's a string problem.
Yes.
If all 6 strings of that guitar have that problem, then it's a guitar problem.
Yeah.
So my first piece of advice would be to get a different first string and put it on there, and don't pull it and stretch it. Just put it on and let it settle naturally and check it then.
A lot of string companies, one very major one recently, has had a lot of trouble getting their nylon extrusions correct. And it's a very, very difficult process, because essentially what you're trying to do is squeeze out plastic out of a die and then make sure that it comes out at an even enough rate so that way it is completely uniform and circular, or as they say in the extrusion industry, it has a high degree of ovality. I've had the opportunity to visit several extruders, and to see the process is crazy, because what they'll do is they are basically forcing their nylon blend, and it's not just pure nylon, it's nylon with additives.
A lot of formulas out there now.
It goes through a 3-chamber heating process, typically. They can play with the texture and durability of the nylon through the heating process, through heating it up, cooling it, and heating it, or some combination, and within 1/10 of a degree actually matters. And I don't care if we're in Fahrenheit or Celsius, it matters.
Yes.
It gets forced through a die, at which point there's an air gap where it essentially cools, and then it goes into a water bath at a specific temperature, comes out, and then goes into another water bath at a lower temperature, and then much further down the line, you now have a laser that is measuring that ovality.
Yeah.
So when they are measuring essentially a cooled bit of nylon that's been extruded 25 feet down the line. And that is very highly dependent on your puller speed and your extrusion methodology and the condition of your die.
Yeah.
And so it's a really, really, really tough process. So if you get a bad string from time to time, just change the string, or you can do what the old lute guys do and flip it. Because what you're trying to do is make sure that all of your mass is equally distributed over the suspended area between the nut and the saddle.
Correct. I've done that trick many times, and I have to admit, I have yet to have one nylon string play in tune when I flipped it, to the point that I've just given up doing that. The nylon is so cheap, comparatively speaking.
Yeah.
I just throw the string away and get a new one. So you may have to go through several, particularly if you've bought your strings in big batches. It may be that batch had problems. And the only way you will find that out is when you put the string on the guitar and go to tune it.
I guess the best way to describe how to fix it, or to test for it, I should say, is to play the 12th fret harmonic, so just a light touch, and then play the same note with a very neutral fingering, no vibrato, just enough to stop the note.
Yeah.
And if you hear a difference, or actually this is where I would advise the use of a strobe tuner, check with that strobe. And if you can get the initial strobe straight on with the harmonic, and then you see kind of something in movement to the fret, then typically it's a false string.
Yeah.
You also may want to give that string a few moments to stretch out if you are putting it on.
Definitely. You want the string to be settled, because when you put them on fresh, they're stretching and everything's kind of up for grabs until they get comfortable and settled into their tension and position and
oddly
pitch.
enough, they don't actually stretch out in a uniform manner.
That's right.
You would think that because you've got it suspended, it's all stretching at it doesn't.
You know what? What's really surprising, and no one believes this, modern gut is actually more accurate than the best nylon.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, because modern gut is a very uniform product, and it's sized with a machine called a centerless grinder. So the uniformity of the outside of the string is absolutely accurate to within a 10,000th of an inch. Whereas nylon, if you measure it, there's some inaccuracies there, which is part of what accounts for the slight inharmonicity of the string.
Yes, and we should also point out that modern gut is more dense than nylon.
Yes.
So it's actually a brighter string. It's not a duller string. So,
that's correct.
It's not quite to carbon.
Nope.
But
it's in between.
It's in between. The best examples of a nylonized version of that is like the Hanebach Goldens.
Yes.
Which has a very minutely, slightly different sound than the gut, but it's very similar. Or the titanium, whatever ones have titanium in it, or the hybrid carbon, Nile carbon, or whatever.
Yeah. The only problem for gut is it's expensive, and if you're playing with nails, you're going to wear it out very quickly.
The third problem, which you don't have, but I do,
Yes.
if your hands sweat, the gut will take up the moisture.
And the sweat will actually dissolve the gut.
And it'll dissolve the gut, and it'll make it longer, so your intonation is going to be off.
Yes. As you use the string, it will deteriorate.
I played on gut on my violin for about a year.
Yeah.
And that year, playing gut on my violin taught me more about intonation than anything else. Because I was playing...
If not economics.
That too. And I would play, and I'd play a note, and I'd do like a trill, and because my hands were sweating midway through my practice round, I would go back for that note, and it wasn't where I left it.
There's a reason why nylon became the de facto material, regardless of its other inherent problems.
Yes. So the next question is about setting up for alternate tunings, like a dadgad or something like that.
Yeah, D-A-D-A, whatever,
Or, so anything, any other alternate tunings other than the standard E to E.
And we're talking for nylon strings here.
Yeah, for nylon strings, I think that we should keep this discussion to nylon. Steel is going to be slightly different, but actually kind of a similar answer.
Yes, yeah. When you're altering your pitches that much, then you're, of course, altering the tension.
Yes.
In the case of steel, if you're trying to go up in pitch, you may run into the situation where your third string breaks because it's not going to go up to A or whatever.
Yeah.
With nylon, the nylon is more forgiving in that regard. However, if you're dropping the tension, any issues you had with intonation of the strings wanting to go sharp as you play, for instance, that's going to get magnified because you reduce the tension. If you're just using that alternative tuning for one piece or something, probably can get away with the standard set retuned. It's not ideal. If you're using that as your de facto tuning system, you probably want to consider having selecting custom gauges of strings specifically for those pitches.
Yeah, and that is going to be a lot of math, or you can kind of see to the pants it. It's kind of a pain if you only have a guitar that's set up for it, but on the other hand, if you want a guitar that's only set up for that, give me a call. There's kind of a micro tensions within the tension, so you can't just buy like a medium tension set of strings. You might have to buy what they call is a gauged string. And so, you know, you have to figure out, like, where does my first string need to be? So if I'm tuning D to D instead of E to E, you might want to consider using a high tension or super high tension first string and just bringing it to a D, so that way you are maintaining the proper amount of mass over the string without being out of whack.
Right.
And if you are turning your G to an A, you might want to consider a medium or a low tension, depending on
definitely, I'd say a lower tension.
So
the low tension, definitely.
Basically, if it's for one piece, don't worry about it. You might not be able to have that action as low as you want it to, especially in drop D, because that string is over moving.
Yeah.
But if you are having a single guitar for a single piece, absolutely. But don't take it to your standard pitches, because especially on steel, like you said, something that's tuned down a step may not actually make it up that whole step without any dire consequences.
Well, here's a tip for that, because the most standard sets of nylon strings for classical guitar, the 3 treble strings, which are monofilament nylon, all come within a very narrow range of gauges and so on. So they're all within a very narrow range, all pretty much same tension within very small increments. Not enough to account for these custom tunings.
Right.
Deodario does make gauged nylon in incremental sizes.
Yep.
If you go to them, you can buy or have your Deodario dealer order for you. You can probably get a special nylon specifically that would be the ideal gauge for that. Likewise, for the bass strings, that's where the different companies do offer options there. And so, for instance, if you're tuning that 6th string constantly down to a D or even lower,
you can buy a 7th, 8th, or 9th string, which is a larger diameter. Now, you might actually have to take your guitar to your local luthier to have them remount that bridge hole slightly larger.
Yeah, your bridge hole might not be big enough to take the gauge of that string, but you have to have that enlarged.
Yeah.
And that's something that would have to be done professionally. Don't try to do that yourself.
Home guitar work at that level can get scary really fast.
Yeah, and the bridge, you don't want to mess up your bridge, because then you get into some very expensive work if you mess that up.
Yeah, making a new bridge is very costly.
Yeah, but there are gauge strings for the basses that you can get, starting with your D string and going all the way down for whatever pitch you might want to use.
Yeah, and if you want to pick our brains some more, feel free to drop us a line, call us, or even come in, because earlier today we've had about 3 people come in that, well, they're you.
Yeah.
Our watchers do come in quite often and like to pick our brain. So please feel free to do so. I've got my website in the bio and everything. Anyways, let's keep going. We got a question about nylon versus carbon, or anything in between, and which is better, without forgetting about nail wear and so on and so forth. And let's address the nail wear right off the bat. Unless you're playing a rectified string, which is one that has been extruded oversized and then sent through a centerless grinder, and they're basically scratchy and noisy and sticky to your fingers. I'm not a big fan of them. I can't remember the last time I had somebody say, I want a ground string on my guitar.
Pepe Romero uses those. because he grew up playing on gut
That's
strings.
true. Okay,
So,
one.
yes,
One.
yes.
Okay, so for the most part, these strings are not going to wear out your nails quickly. I find that carbon is actually gentler on your nails, but I'm also not a great guitarist and I don't keep fingernails, so...
I have some experience with that. What I can tell you as a flamenco player, it's not the treble strings that wear down your nails, even the ground ones, the rectified ones. What wears them down is the windings on the bass strings if you're doing rasgueados, in which you're playing across the strings on the top of your nail. That wears your nail down very quickly. Most classical guitarists don't do much rasgueado, so that's not an issue for them. But it is the windings on the bass strings that do create most of your nail wear, even though you may not realize that.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Now, as far as the differences of strings, basically, the carbon strings are not... It's not carbon. It's not like you're taking charcoal and sprinkling it.
It's a misnomer.
It's like it's a fluorocarbon, which is basically a different kind of nylon with a slightly different structure,
Higher density.
with a higher density. So, a carbon string is a denser string, meaning it has a smaller diameter.
Correct.
And because it's got a smaller diameter, it can break into higher partials.
Yes.
Giving the sensation of being louder and being potentially slightly louder because most likely you have a better efficient use of energy in the string.
Yeah. Less internal friction.
Yes, that's a good band name.
Yes. That's right. And basically, your choice of which of those to use is up to you as a player, of what your aesthetic is based on your guitar, your nails, your playing, and what you like for a sound. Some players really like that bright sound. They feel like it projects better, and higher partials and overtones do in a dead concert hall more effectively project to the audience than a lower pitched, more fundamental tonal bass would.
Yeah, and that's not to say that you have to use all three carbon strings on the treble.
That's right.
I know a lot of great players that use a nylon first and a carbon second and third. Because that first string can get very screechy and very shrill. And maybe your guitar has a little bit of deadness on that third string. Most of them do, and I think that's because the diameter to length ratio gets off on that third string, because they actually do that one a little bit more visually than mathematically.
It's not mathematically balanced. That's correct.
Right. By reducing the diameter on that third string, you'd have a better third string sound.
One issue for the carbon strings, depending on your aesthetics as a player, because they are slippery, as we've pointed out, it's more difficult to get an effective vibrato. And that's one of the complaints I hear from players, that I don't like carbon strings because they aren't as warm. And I think what they're really saying is, I try to give it that brilliance and vibrato, and I'm not getting it like I did with nylon. So there's one factor that might affect your choice.
Take that into account. I always say try it. My big warning with carbon is that they are slippery. This is going to be my second time mentioning it in this video. Put an extra wrap on the bridge side and give yourself a lot of extra space, so that way as you're pulling it up, if it starts to stretch and slip through its own knot, you've got some room. Especially you 12-hole guys. I have very rarely seen a 12-hole bridge guitar without a string slap under that first string. And inevitably, when I ask them, they go, yeah, I use carbon, and it happens a lot. I've got a great video on how to tie a 12-hole bridge, so that way it doesn't happen to you. Does the saddle have to be bone, or can it be wood?
Well, the saddle could be wood. I mean, some of the antique guitars were even made without a saddle at all. The string just looped around basically a sort of a rectangular block that was the bridge, and where it looped under itself, the loop became the saddle.
Well,
even that Antonio Torres guitar restored, the little one, that's how that was made.
Well,
it actually worked.
Even like a lute, they will still have that, or a Theorbo.
Yes, it's not as effective as a separate saddle with a bone saddle. Bone is very hard. You could make the saddle out of wood, what will happen is that the string will very quickly dig into the wood
Yep.
and bury itself into that, even if it's ebony, because by comparison, ebony is very soft compared to bone
Right.
or ivory.
So one of the reasons we use bone is because we're not allowed to use ivory anymore.
All right.
And it's a much more efficient use of the energy in the string. We want to have that return back.
Yeah.
And so if the wood, since it's a bunch of cells kind of loosely clumped together, it's constantly grinding against itself, and it will wear really quickly. I mean, we see guitars with ebony saddles because people wanted it because of the aesthetic. And they're like, oh, my guitar is too low now, and it's like 2 years old, and they've kind of worn through that,
They've
that
gone
saddle.
the whole string diameter or more down into the saddle. Even the nylon will grind into it like that.
So it's more about durability. It's not necessarily about sound. And to point out that there were guitars for quite some time that just had a metal bar as a saddle. Like the James Ashburn, the Hausers, the Viennese style Hausers.
It's a very traditional Viennese type Germanic model.
Yeah, it's efficient because you just whack a fret into there because you've already got 19 others.
Typically,
and sometimes 20 with that 0 fret.
Yeah, typically those are on the guitars that have those detachable necks with a little cork with a little clock screw in it to adjust the height of the action through the neck angle, so the bridge is never touched.
Right.
And in that context, that works perfectly fine.
In context, I think it actually is brilliant because those guitars generally are designed so closely to the failure point that if you mess up that action height above the top, you will pull it apart.
Yeah, it keeps you from doing that.
Basically, it allowed for easy adjustability at home because if you can turn a screwdriver, you can essentially adjust your action height, and by maintaining that height above the top, they maintained the sound that they wanted to build into the guitar.
And Hauser actually made a few Spanish models with that clock key adjustable neck. Yeah, with a floating fingerboard.
That's an odd little.
It's
well, I've done that too.
It wasn't real common, but it was done. So.
Yeah, we've seen a couple of those. What fretboard radius do we use on our guitars?
Whatever they ask for.
Okay. Yes. I think in reality, I know a lot of steel guys like they're 18 and 24 and whatever. Every single guitar that we do a fingerboard on is set up to that player with reasonable deference, so that way we can other people can play it up. It's not like a sport coat where
some people require more or less radius. A lot of people that say, oh, it has to be perfectly flat, they actually don't realize there's a slight radius usually in there anyway.
Right.
But it's so subtle they don't notice.
Right. If you have a fingerboard that has no radius on it and you play a bar chord, it's actually going to feel like your finger's trying to turn inside out.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to push more in that first and second knuckle region rather than letting your natural biomechanics take advantage of it. That said, we also do a complex twisted plane.
That's correct.
So
we don't have one single radius that's throughout the whole length of that fretboard either.
Right. So
it's a very complex
we roll
geometry.
off on the treble, we roll off on the bass in various areas in order to get the playability that much better. So that way we can set up these guitars at 2.5 millimeters on the bass string that don't buzz unless you have poor technique. We can really push the limits with the way that we shape our fingerboards far more than just a radius. And so if you're interested in having your radius done for your guitar, call us because we'll make it right.
Yeah.
So for our last question, this is one that we both have definite thoughts. Can a cheap Spanish guitar be revoiced? The short answer is yes. The long answer is you shouldn't.
Yeah, you could spend a lot of money chasing after it, and we see it done all the time where people say, well, we can shave the braces or all that, which is basically a subtractive approach. The only thing you can guarantee is it's maybe not going to sound the way it sounds now. Whether it's better or worse, that's a matter of opinion. And there's no real glory in that.
No, in reality, if you're doing this on a $300 guitar, you're still left with a $300 guitar.
Yeah.
And maybe you've gone too far, and now the structural component or one of the structural components of your guitar is not doing what it's supposed to do. So for a very short-term gain of a slight improvement of sound, you've lost long-term in terms of longevity of this. And by the way, once you remove wood, it's really hard. Trust us, we're luthiers. It's really hard to put it back.
So sometimes the things that need to be done are not subtractive but additive.
Yes.
And you can't change thick finishes which impede sound.
Yep.
You can't change bridges that are just clumsy and ugly.
And probably poorly glued down.
Yes, and poorly glued on, and you can't really change bad fretwork unless you're going to do an $800 fret job. So on,
Right.
you know, beyond a decent set of strings, maybe a new nut and maybe a new saddle.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. You've done 90% of the work there.
Yeah, and at that point in time, with whatever gets charged for revoicing it, those funds would be better spent put into a new guitar.
Yeah.
So with that said, thank you so much for watching. Keep asking these questions. We love them. Until next time, see you later.
Thanks for watching.